I wasn't sure whether to come here because I don't do research on meaning. So I wasn't sure about the fit, and Paul said, well, just talk about whatever you wanted. And I do research on well-being, so I'm going to give kind of a critical talk about the state of well-being research. I think things are kind of dire in some ways, as I'll point out, but I also think there's some pretty simple fixes, which I'm going to suggest that we consider adapting, mainly by taking more of a motivational approach to thinking about happiness and the distinctions around happiness. So balkanizing, not everybody knows what that means, but it means to split up into smaller and smaller pieces that are all kind of competing for a shrinking pie. And I think that's kind of what's happening in happiness or well-being research today. I think it's kind of confusing and maybe slowing the progress of the field. So my goals are to show you or perhaps convince you of what's happening. I'm going to critique the concept of eudaimonic well-being, which is a very common blanket term which is overused and creates a lot of problems, in my opinion. I'm going to offer 4 suggestions for solving some of the problems that I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to go through what I call my Eudaimonic Activity Model, which I think gives us a way to solve, to implement all 4 of those suggestions. So this talk is going to be a little bit more for researchers, but I hope that people here for other reasons can also get something out of it. That's my wish. All right, last week, my family and I spent 6 days backpacking around the Wonderland Trail in Mount Rainier. So that's me taking a selfie of my wife and my 2 sons. This is my wife way up on top of a crag in front of the glaciers of Mount Rainier. And we were having an incredible time. That's why we go out there and do these things despite some of the discomfort that we have to endure. And we were extremely happy, or at least we thought we were, but now it's not clear what happiness is. So bear with me. So I've been studying issues of happiness and well-being my whole career, and my friends sarcastically call me Dr. Happy. This is a picture taken in Oregon on a backpacking trip, 2009. We found a Walmart balloon way up in the wilderness, and they made me wear it for the rest of the day. So, you know, that's what I'm kind of known for in some ways. And what lay people ask me is, so what's happiness? What is it? And I used to know the answer to this question. It used to be fairly simple, that happiness is scientifically defined as subjective well-being. This is the Diener approach. Ed Diener, the guru of well-being research. That it's a combination of feeling good, not feeling bad, and being generally satisfied with what's happening. That's the subjective well-being score. And so then my friends or lay people ask, okay, great, that sounds reasonable. How do I get that? And then I'm off, because then I start talking about my research. And you know, I'm just going to go over just a couple things that I found just to show what you can start to figure out if you've got a stable target. Like if you know what the thing is that you're trying to study and you've got a way to measure it. One thing that Sonia Leovomirsky and I found out pretty early, we addressed the question of, can happiness change? And our conclusion was, yeah, there's a certain proportion of happiness that's based in intentional activity. It's not just your circumstances, your income, it's not just your genetic set point, that we can do something. And we've been kind of trying to figure out what that something is that we can do. And just going through a bunch of quick findings, all in sort of a humanistic vein, what I've found is that subjective well-being is boosted by activities that bring us psychological need satisfaction, to express deeper parts of our personality, self-concordant parts, that express intrinsic or pro-social values instead of selfish values, that express or are expressed in an authentic way, balanced use of our time. We had one article, affects changes in well-being. So there's a lot of stuff that I've looked at using this stable target, subjective well-being. And so what I like to do in designing a study is adopt a theory and say, okay, this theory says this is what people ought to do to be happy or to thrive, to have well-being. Let's test it. So it's a prescription. There are many prescriptions of positive psychology. We need to figure out which ones work. So I try to show that the prescription following it brings well-being. I also try to show that I try to compare alternative theories so we can rule some things out and we can put them aside and know what's better to focus on going forward. So just one example of a research study that pursued this strategy. This going way back to 2001. I was a postdoc at Rochester with DC and Ryan, very prominent motivational researchers. And self-determination theory says there's three basic needs: autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And I said, okay, great, maybe that's true, I don't know. We need to compare them to other candidate needs so we can test that. So in this study, we identified 10 candidate psychological needs. There they are. There's relatedness, autonomy, competence. But other theories said, okay, pleasure, health, meaning, security, status, money. And we asked participants to write down the most satisfying thing that had happened to them in the last month or week or year, many different time frames. And then we asked them to rate to what extent are these 10 experiences present during that satisfying event. And just as SDT, self-determination theory, said, autonomy, competence, and relatedness were in the top, actually 4. What came out highest of all, not significantly, but was self-esteem, which is not a need according to self-determination theory. That's interesting. Maybe the theory is wrong. I think it's actually more complicated. It's good to feel self-esteem. It's not good to pursue it, as Jennifer Crocker has showed us. So it's a little bit tricky with that one. But the main point is, so we found support for SDT's 3 needs, and these other group here didn't get as much support, including meaning. And this was the sample of undergraduates in a 3-item meaning measure, so I'm not saying this is definitive, but in this particular test, we also found that we regressed mood-related well-being. On all 10 of these, we got the same 4 winners. So from a methodological, statistical point of view, we did a test, and there were winners in the test, and maybe we can use that and we can go forward. All right. So why do I care about subjective well-being? Actually, I don't. I'm not a fan of it. I'm not a believer in it. I just think it provides a pretty good signal of whether a person's thriving. In evolutionary psychology, an honest signal is a signal that this organism is thriving, it's healthy, it's really living its life to the best. It's a dominant in the sense of being the one you want to mate with. Dominant person, dominant organism. And I think, actually I'm doing a paper on this with my wife Melly, who's an evolutionary psychologist, that subjective well-being is a pretty reasonable symbol or indicator of thriving, because you don't get it very easily. You have to do the right stuff. So if you're doing the right stuff, then you have this glow that other people can see and they can feel coming off of you. And if you're not doing the right stuff, you have this different kind of look. And I'll come back to this in a minute. I feel pretty safe in this audience, but a Duchenne smile is a smile in which your whole face participates. And it's difficult to fake it. We were in Russia this summer and dealing with customer service people who had been trained to deal with Westerners coming over, and they had been trained to smile. So when they looked at our passport, oh, they were Americans. We saw that at least twice. And they were not, one woman in particular was not able to make that look like that, which is what you look like when you really feel it. All right, so my background, my assumptions are that human beings are good. We're basically good. I mean, I'm very optimistic in these days to say that, but I still kind of believe it, kind of. Dr. Keltner makes a great argument for this point of view, coming from an Ekman emotional, universal emotions point of view. We evolved to be good and to feel good and to have high subjective well-being, I would say, when we're pulling that off. All right, so what are the advantages of using subjective well-being as an indicator of good living? And I'm saying it's an indicator. I'm not saying it is good living, but it's a symptom of good living. Just going to quickly go through some advantages. I think it's relatively content-free. If you look at a measure of positive, negative mood, life satisfaction, they don't presuppose any particular thing that the person is doing. It's fairly objective, fairly neutral. I mean, you can quibble about what emotions should go into the emotion measure, but I think to the extent that your theory starts to put item content into the outcome measure, we've got circularity, and we're lost in a hall of mirrors. So I think subjective well-being lets us stay somewhat apart from the theories that we're testing. I like to use the term psychosocial content. That's what we're trying to test. What's the best way to be, the best attitude, the best practice? Mindfulness, forgiveness, gratitude, who knows? That's content. We don't want to put that content into our outcome measure, because then we're lost. Another reason I like the measure is it makes it easier to compare across cultures. The PANIS, for example, has been pretty well validated in multiple cultures. Metric equivalence is pretty good. I don't use the word happiness in my research because that begins to bring psychosocial content in. In Russia, the word for happiness is счастье. And I'm not Russian, so I can't tell you what that means, but it's complicated. And it's, you can talk about, there's Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. It's an existential approach. It's an ideal. Yeah. Maybe Dimitri could tell us. We don't have time. Sorry, Dimitri. Another reason I like it is that it's a fairly simple and unitary measure. Busseri and colleagues have shown, yeah, you can get 3 factors if you push it, but really there's one, and they all correlate 0.6. So you can combine them into a single measure, but you can also look at them separately. Does a practice or a habit or an attitude or a goal, does it boost positive affect or does it lower negative affect? Does it boost satisfaction? But for the most part, you can combine the 3 and simplify. If we've got an agreed upon definition of what well-being is or how to measure it, we can make a lot more progress a lot more quickly because we've only got 1 or 2 or 3. I guess you guys on the wings can't see my laser pointer. We've only got 1 or 2 or 3 outcomes if we're talking about well-being instead of up to 500 or more, as you'll see in a minute. So again, this is another thing of what I've done. If you've got a stable target, so you can ask the question, well, is it possible for well-being to go up like in the red line and then stay up? Or are we always going to come back to our, what Licken and Tellegen have called our set point, genetically determined disposition and temperament? That's a very interesting question, but you can't start to ask it unless you've got a measure of happiness or well-being that you trust. This is one of my favorite studies that I think might supply the most actual information to a happiness seeker, and I'm not going to try to go through it. This is with Sonia back in 2012, but the question was, if you've got some positive change happen to your life that makes your well-being go up from time 1 to time 2, how can you sustain that well-being boost at time 3? What does it take? Are we just going to fall back where we started? Well, you can do it, but it takes effort. You have to keep having positive experiences of that positive change. You take your car out for a drive, have a date night with your new spouse. Keep doing stuff with that change so that you get lots of positive emotions on a daily basis, but at the same time, resist the tendency to want more and better. The longer we can prolong wanting more and better of the change, the longer the boost will continue. I wish I could take more time to explain that because I love this finding. All right, so looking around the field today, the answer to the question, what is well-being, has become much more difficult to answer. And the answer, I'm afraid to say this kind of, but it seems to be, nowadays, the answer is whatever the research wants it to be, the researcher wants it to be. And I'm talking about, mainly about the concept of eudaimonic well-being, which, by the way, I totally believe in it. I've been studying it my whole career, but we've got it mislabeled. And it's causing, to me, a lot of problems. And if you look at what is labeled as eudaimonic well-being, it quickly becomes pretty clear that all it means is random positive psychology construct. I'm serious. If you actually look, first of all, becoming more and more popular, everybody uses this term now. Okay, so how do you measure eudaimonic well-being? Here's just a partial list. And so you just get a grab bag of positive sounding measures, throw them in your study. Oh, I need a term for them when it's time to write up. Oh, we measured eudaimonic well-being by doing this, this, and this. Just pointing out, so one of the things in here has been called eudaimonic well-being is ego development according to the Lovinger sentence completion and coding measure, which is very different from self-report. It's a measure of cognitive development more than it is a measure of happiness, but it gets lumped in as a measure of eudaimonic well-being. And there's a lot more. It's just more and more coming out. So we've got this category, eudaimonic well-being. It's kind of in the center here of the circle, and it's getting bigger and bigger. And the only thing that's not in that category is good old positive affect, negative affect, and life satisfaction, because they're subjective well-being. That's different than eudaimonic well-being. So, yeah, it's defined. What is it? Well, it's not subjective well-being. That's almost the closest you can get to a theoretical definition. And then, from my point of view, this is also a problem that the research will say, oh, we wanted to measure hedonic well-being. And we use subjective well-being as our measure of hedonic well-being. And hedonic well-being is basically the idea, pleasure, you're selfish, you're short-sighted, all you care about is your own welfare. So, I mean, this is when I start to get a little bit riled when I see these studies, because suddenly subjective well-being is the bad guy. And from my point of view, it's the thing that we need to actually start to winnow down our constructs and our theories. So, I mean, I wrote this book in 2004, Optimal Human Being. Nobody read it. That's okay. But it was an attempt to, what is optimal human being at different levels of analysis and assess the research literature at each level. And a lot of what I was doing was looking at what predicts subjective well-being. And a lot of it was exactly the same stuff that a eudaimonic positive psychology researcher would expect. I mean, the stuff that predicts well-being subjective well-being is the good stuff. So when I'm talking to my friends, what's happiness? I can't tell them anymore. I think we have the same problem in the general public. Like, these people don't even know they all disagree with each other. They don't even know what they're measuring. They don't know what they're doing with it. So, in a way, the problem gets even worse. There's these competing, I call them meta systems of well-being. Seligman has his PERMA model, the positive affect, emotion, meaning, forget what the other one is, accomplishment. I mean, that's fine. Maybe those are the top 5 most important things we should focus on. He just kind of drew them out of thin air, as far as I can tell. Carroll's system was really great. I'm not trying to pick on you, Carroll, at all. I think you did it the right way. But still, it's got 6 facets of psychological well-being, which you can maybe see here. Trying to stay away from the details, at least for now. Felicia Huppard's got a measure of flourishing, or a model of flourishing, that's got 11 different facets of flourishing in it. So the question is, how are we going to compare these? Can we achieve parsimony? Can we make things simpler in some way? Maybe. And how do we answer the question, what is well-being? All right. So I think what we've done is we've balkanized the concept of happiness, little fiefdoms in a way, where they're isolated from each other. Well, not isolated, but there's not enough attention to comparing and integrating and winnowing. All right. Just a couple things about why do we do this. I think there's a number of different reasons, and they all make sense, and I agree with them, actually, in some ways. One is that if you use subjective well-being as a criterion for your studies, that you're going to compare different theories as to how they predict well-being. Seems to imply that happiness is the goal. We should all be pursuing happiness. Well, yeah, that's what the Declaration of Independence tells us. But we shouldn't be doing it directly. It's a mistake to do it directly, but on the other hand, it is valuable. Referring to, well, it's not the goal. That's what I mean to say. It's a side effect. It's a side effect, but it's an important side effect. It's an honest signal. You only get it by doing the right stuff. And if you approach it directly, it doesn't work. Some positive psychology intervention research that goes after positive mood or negative mood or satisfaction directly. And they don't work as well as if you have the person try to improve themselves, try to make connections, try to learn and grow. We just had a study that came out this year which showed that setting a goal to become happier didn't work. It's a side effect. It's an epiphenomenon almost. You have to do things that matter and are meaningful, and then you might get subjective well-being as a side effect. Okay, why else do we do this? There's some truth to this stereotype, but I don't think as much as we believe. The myth of the happy hedonist says that the world is full of people who are too happy. They're immoral and they're happy. And we can't just let their happiness be the sign of the quality of their living because they're not living well. But I call it a myth because that's what it is. If you look at the data, selfish, self-centered, pleasure-focused, narcissistic, materialistic ways of being do not bring subjective well-being. My friend Tim Kasser, his book that came out in 2002, The High Price of Materialism, is all about how if you're materialistic and status-oriented and all the rest of it, it's going to backfire, and you're going to end up less happy than you could have been. So, here we go. And this is controversial maybe, but we're actually collecting some data on this. You almost never see Donald Trump with the real, authentic, melting into that smile, connecting with others. It doesn't happen. It's always some weird grimace or smirk. And I think the guy's really pretty unhappy. I really think he is, and that's why he's always self-aggrandizing and saying, I'm awesome, and my inaugural crowd was huge. And I think he's kind of miserable. He's got a lot of power, a lot of attention, but it's not doing it for him. Meanwhile, what does it take to actually get subjective well-being, to actually smile in that important way? You have to do the good stuff, the right stuff. So what I'm saying is that subjective well-being as a measure is not the goal, the side effect, but it's sufficient to distinguish between what we would like to call higher moral, eudaimonic, virtuous ways of being and less admirable, more selfish ways of being. So we don't need new measures of well-being to show us what we already know just using subjective well-being. We don't need a whole bunch of measures on the outcome side. We need to keep them on the predictor side and then compare them and test them with a reasonable criterion like subjective well-being. I was kind of saying you have to be happy in this glowing, this genuine way to be virtuous. and being virtuous helps you be happy. It's the cycle that people can get into. It can be difficult, but the only way to go. So I like to make a distinction between, not just my distinction, it goes way back, 3 faculties of mind. There's the cognitive or motivational faculty, and that's characterized by acting, willing, goals, volition. There's the cognitive faculty, knowing, thinking, reasoning, and there's the affective or emotional faculty of mind. That's a pretty reasonable way to split things up. I think that all positive psychology prescriptions concern conation or motivation. They're saying, try this attitude, be mindful, do random acts of kindness, pursue the right kinds of goals. It's all things that, you buy the book, somebody's book, to tell you what are the right things to try to do, to be motivated to do. So we have all these prescriptions floating around in positive psychology, but not all of them work, probably. So we need a way to weed them out, some of them, or winnow them down. All right. And meanwhile, this term, eudaimonic well-being, and some related ones, becomes ever more popular, ever more diffuse. To me, it confounds the 2 faculties of mind, emotion and conation. And it confuses actions and resulting states. It confuses causes and outcomes. It doesn't have to, but it just tends to if we're not really careful. So does it really matter whether we call, say, the practicing gratitude, that's a cognitive activity, does it matter whether we call that gratitude, do we call it a cognitive or an emotional construct? Maybe it's just semantics. Sometimes I think so, and I'm just all worried about nothing. But I really do think that if we can be more precise in our terminology and definitions, we can make better progress. And if we can't even keep the distinction between a motivated practice and an emotional result straight, it's not clear how much progress we can make. All right, so here's an example. Happiness is a warm puppy. Charles Schultz, the old Peanuts comic strip. We can all agree with that. Happiness is a warm puppy, right? No, happiness is not a warm puppy. Puppies might cause happiness. That's an empirical question. We need to design the study. If we give the pet to the person living in the assisted living, does that make them happier? If we give the person a service dog or a service animal, if we give the child a new pet, does that make them happier? Well, let's find out. Let's do the study. We'll talk afterwards. So I think in positive psychology, we're making the same mistake. The happiness is a warm puppy mistake. Happiness is gratitude, forgiveness, compassion, mindfulness. Really, it can be anything. Happiness is that thing. The distinction between cause and outcome becomes blurred. And I get really cynical. I look at it this way, that, you think of some positive psychology adjective or characteristic or trait that nobody else has studied before. You make up a scale. You might not even do the research to show that it brings subjective well-being. You just call it a eudaimonic well-being, and you make the link with words instead of with data. All right. So I've got 4 suggestions. And again, I'm probably coming off as more contentious than I want to. I don't think the problem is as bad as I'm making it, but I'm trying to make it clear anyway. Suggestion number 1, pretty easy. Whenever you can, if you're doing a study, an intervention study, a counseling study, whatever, try to include a measure of subjective well-being along with everything else. It's like if researchers had a common base to use to compare studies with meta-analyses later on, it's really going to help us. I've got it down to 11 items, so it's not that much. This is a positive negative mood scale that my mentor, Bob Emmons, published in 1991. Bernstein had a 2-item life satisfaction scale. It works as well as Diener's 5-item measure. So 11 items, it's not that much. Suggestion number 2, please don't, I would ask, use subjective well-being as your measure of hedonic well-being. Hedonic well-being is the bad guy. You know, it's the narcissistic, selfish, bad, or not so good way to be. Subjective well-being should be an ally of eudaimonia researchers, not a foil, not the thing that you are trying to distinguish from. If you want to measure hedonic well-being, measure it with items that get at the psychosocial content that it contains, which is, you know, mindless pleasure, addiction, wallowing. That's what hedonic well-being is supposed to mean, at least at a conceptual level. Suggestion number 3, I'd rather we didn't have this term eudaimonic well-being again, because it's collapsing motivation and emotion, causes and outcomes in many cases. The constructs that are called eudaimonic well-being constructs are all about doing well. However, the researcher might define that from their theoretical perspective, their beliefs, their intuition. So maybe a better term than eudaimonic well-being would be eudaimonic activity. Well, that's pretty subtle difference. Does that really matter? I think it does, because it preserves these differences that I'm talking about. Solution number 4, instead of just continually throwing out new scales and new concepts and never kind of bringing them together and testing them and comparing them, let's, as a field, try to do that phase more than we do. You know, maybe the incentives don't favor that, but I think it's actually really exciting to take this theory, this theory, or this theory and design a study where you're going to let them battle it out with each other. And maybe you can learn something really helpful. So we're trying to reach parsimony just as much as we're trying to expand and have more and more ideas. Okay, so last part of my talk. I guess I'm moving faster than I thought. But time for questions, right? I've published what I call the Eudaimonic Activity Model, and it's not even a model, it's just a framework, sort of a meta framework, you could call it, that I think embodies all 4 of these suggestions or recommendations. And all it says is people are doing stuff. We're out in the world doing things. We're going to the new workout program, we're getting married, we're getting a puppy, we're waking up earlier because we think that's when our best thought is, or whatever it is. We're doing experiments in our lives constantly. And those experiments give us experiential results. But those experiential results may or may not be satisfying. If you blow your budget buying, you know, the $300 shoes, and then after a couple of days your friends stop noticing it, that wasn't the right decision. And maybe you should think a little more carefully about how to spend your money. So a eudaimonic activity is one that, a little bit of circular, but there's ways around it, is one that provides satisfying experiences according to your model of satisfaction. Self-determination theory says autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So from that point of view, eudaimonic activity satisfies your psychological needs. And then those experiences in turn bring you subjective well-being as a side effect. So it's just as simple as the yellow line at the bottom. We're doing stuff. If we do the right stuff, we're satisfied, and then we're happy. I think that's what we're all doing as best we can. All right, so how does this fit with Aristotle's conception of eudaimonia? Fits very well. I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, but he said happiness is the thing that we want, but we shouldn't focus on it directly. Eudaimonia is the virtuous activities that we might or might not do. So in a nutshell, what he was saying would be the best person you can be, and happiness will follow, but don't try to be happy directly. That's missing the point. All right. A bunch of studies where we've tested this model and found support for it, that psychological need satisfaction from the self-determination theory framework mediates or explains why some activity, practice, goal, value, attitude brings you greater well-being. It's because it gives you need satisfaction, and then you have the increased well-being. Yeah, even Ryan Hutta and DC have found some support for that. So actually, what do DC and Ryan, my mentors, say about this? They were writing about this before I was and doing important work. I'm pretty late on the scene. And actually, all I'm saying is what they say in this article that they published in 2008. First of all, they said, yes, eudaimonia properly conceived is a motivational or cognitive concept. It involves living well, something you do. Okay, so that's what I'm saying. And they also said in that same article that psychological need satisfaction is the most logical mediator explaining why living well makes you happy, because it satisfies your needs. So that's all I'm saying is the same thing that they were saying back in 08. And I've come along and I call it the Eudaimonic Activity Model to try to generalize it beyond SDT a little bit. So I'm not wedded to the 3 needs of SDT. Maybe there's a need for self-esteem as well. That's an empirical question. All right. Here we are back on Mount Rainier. From the point of view of the Eudaimonic Activity Model, what we were doing was we were engaged in very eudaimonic activity. What does that mean? Well, we were feeling awe, compassion with each other. We were feeling very healthy. We were feeling challenged. Climbing up that last 3,000-foot climb with 40-pound packs in the grueling sun, that was a challenge. And it wasn't all happiness out there. I mean, the mosquitoes were so bad that we often had to put on head nets. No shower for 6 days. Too bad. Tough it out. But we were fine with that because we were having this peak experience. Literally, we were having a peak experience. How do we know we were happy? That's my earlier question. How do we know we were happy? Well, we were doing satisfying things, and we felt good. It's just that simple. All right. 4 questions that I often get when I talk about this stuff. First one, is subjective well-being only a final outcome, or can it do something itself? And here I refer to the great article by Liebermersky, King, and Diener on the benefits of positive affect. Yes, if you're a happy person, you get a lot of benefits. You live longer, you work better, your marriage lasts. And this is the way I like to think about it. Again, I guess I do have time. 3 categories of experiences: eudaimonic practices, satisfying psychosocial experiences, content-free subjective well-being, relatively content-free. So if you do the right stuff, then you get satisfying experiences, then you're happy, but then that well-being can provide a platform or context to do even more, or a virtuous cycle, or an upward spiral, that the 3 things work together. You could call them flourishing, would be a reasonable term to use for that cycle. So yeah, subjective well-being can be a cause in your model, not just always an outcome. Question 2, is subjective well-being the only thing we should study? Not at all. Lots of other things you can look at: physical health, objective performance, adaptive functioning, however you want to define it. You might care about those things more than you care about subjective well-being. That's fine. I'm just saying it would be nice if you had subjective well-being in there so we can compare across studies and do meta-analyses and arrive at some conclusions. Can there be other mediators besides self-determination theory's 3 needs? Sure. It's an empirical question. So Carroll's 6 facets of psychological well-being actually 3 of them, positive relations, autonomy, and mastery, correspond almost exactly to SDT's 3 needs. And then there's 3 additional satisfying experiences, we could call them. It's questionable where to draw the lines, but I think they fit pretty well in the satisfying experiences category that can help explain why doing the right stuff makes you happy. And you can also look at other experiences like awe, inspiration, meaning. Finally, talking about meaning, one of the reasons I don't study it is because I don't know what it means, seriously. But I know you can measure it, and I know it's a positive experience. I like it's meaningful. I feel a sense of meaning, and that can help get you subjective well-being. So the question of what are the most satisfying experiences to have, I think, is ultimately an empirical question. As in that most satisfying event study I talked about earlier, comparing the 10 candidate needs, compares many satisfying experiences as you can pull off, and figure out which ones are the most satisfying or the most influential. All right, I'm almost done. Can you expand this very simple model? So the EAM says, do eudaimonic activities, get satisfying experiences, be happy. Just that simple. But of course, it's not that simple. Can you expand the model? And I would say, yeah. You can bring in context factors, circumstances factors, personality moderators, like courage or meaning making. And let me just show you what that might look like. So far I've been saying, pursue the right goals, the right attitudes, values. I mean, that's for the research to say what those are. You have this path, and then maybe subjective well-being feeds back in to help you do more. But it's unarguable that context, like if you are facing a serious disease or illness, or if you're in a circumstance that denies you of your rights or oppresses you or reduces social justice, that's going to have a negative effect. So, maybe the coefficient on this arrow would be negative if it's a negative context, some problem that you're experiencing. Mosquitoes were dragging us down on Mount Rainier. But then you could say, okay, well, there's personality buffers, like meaning. You have a sense of meaning, or if you are a courageous person. Or in our case, we had head nets. We had head nets that let us buffer against the negative effects of the mosquito. I'm being kind of facetious, but the point is, you can expand and add things to this kind of approach. All right. So the main take-home point that I would try to make is that concept of eudaimonia, when it entered psychology in the 1990s, I think it was very important. It was great that Alan Waterman and others introduced that idea. But whenever a new idea shows up, it has to try to sort of buttress itself, and it's kind of a struggle to establish oneself in the field. And I think there might have been a little bit too much of that that's happened in the field of eudaimonic or positive psychology. So I would say that the concept of eudaimonia goes wrong when it's conceptualized as a new form of well-being that's a better form than the old form. That's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't think we need to take that step. I think we're better off if we try to focus on how should people live their lives in a way that brings them the most satisfaction and happiness. And that's it. Thank you.